So living economics means one of these three things, and the various essays in the book sort of try to grapple with that idea. Now, how did I get, turned on to this project while I was here? This is made up of a lot of stuff I've been doing over the years, and what the opportunity of this did was allow me to select and collect stuff and rewrite some things to fit it all into a thing. Well, the number one thing, and in fact it happened on the way over here today when I was getting picked up, just in casual conversation, they were talking about different minority views related to development economics, and the dreaded word mainstream came up. This is what mainstream people believe versus that. I've always hated this view. One of the views is that as a professional economist, all right, I've never, ever felt discriminated against as a professional economist. I have felt like, for example, sometimes like a kid in the minor league baseball that thinks he's going to be in Major League Baseball but can't hit a Major League curveball, right? Which is what I would say why I'm not teaching at MIT. Not because there's some kind of glass ceiling that's saying, look, you can't go there because you're a non-mainstream economist. I simply don't understand what that means, mainstream, especially since the roots of the economics that I'm following are in Adam Smith, or deeper, as I try to argue in the book. But Adam Smith and David Hume, who in fact would be the same, people. And so I started coming along this idea, which I got from one of my professors when I was younger, Kenneth Boulding, who made a distinction of what he called mainline economics and mainstream economics. And in this, I should also say that two of my inspirations come from my George Mason professor and then colleague, and another one who became a colleague, Jim Buchanan and Vernon Smith. Jim Buchanan over the years could have taught at Chicago, he could have taught at Stanford and everything like that. He always chose to teach where he wanted to teach and what he called dare to be different and teach this idea. And he stresses in his essay, What Should Economists Do?, that it's a quote from Lord Acton, but he says, it's the men who sit in the seat of Adam Smith that demand our attention, not those who are of the popular moment. And he used to ask us actually a lot of times, who would you rather be? John Kenneth Galbraith, who in fact was extremely popular in his day, all right? Or would you rather write a paper that 100 years from now people would read, right? And so that question was there. And Vernon Smith, who again never felt like he was outside of the mainstream even though he was out of sync. And when he went from Purdue to Arizona as opposed to going to Harvard, people said to him, Vernon, you can't go to Arizona. That's not a top-ranked department. And Vernon looked at the guy and said, any department that will hire me is by definition a top-ranked department. And I love that sort of spirit that someone like Vernon Smith has, or Jim Buchanan has, or any of things like that. Jim Buchanan, I had him as a student before he won the Nobel Prize, and he used to use the phrase, to separate economists, he would refer to them as establishment economists, which meant, economists that aren't really good thinking, that is mainly those above the Mason-Dixon line and east of the Mississippi. Anywhere else in the world, Buchanan liked. He just didn't like that region of the United States. As a kid from New Jersey, it was kind of funny because I was like, you can't pick on the Northeast, come on. So in the book, I make this distinction, as I said, I got from Kenneth Boulding, between mainline versus mainstream. Now, I just said that to you, but in the book, what I do is I try to distinguish mainline economics as related to substantive propositions of economics, like what would an economist believe, versus mainstream, which is what is currently fashionable in the science. So keep that distinction in mind, because in a minute you'll see how it is that it really relates to what goes on here at U of M. The other thing that I try to do in the book is I make a strong argument for the idea of the public purpose of economics. This is very influenced by W.H. Hutt, who wrote an essay called Politically Impossible. And it's the idea that economists should never cater their message to those who are in political power, but always instead state their message as clearly as possible, because those in political power will in fact water down whatever they say anyway. So if you try to water it down to cater to them, it will get watered down again and again and again. And so what did you end up by saying? Demand curve slope upward or something. So what you want to do is you want to state clearly and forcefully in as plain language as possible what economics teaches us about a thing, and then just, have that out there. And so what our goal in economics is to actually communicate to our students and to the population in general the basic principles of economics, most important of which is to cultivate an appreciation of spontaneous order, this mystery of the mundane that I was talking about before. And that we should, recognize that role as economic educators. All right, and that's a large part of this. And then that's one of the reasons why, again, when I came here last year with Chris, and we went and visited the Center Henry Hazlitt, and the other economics professors that we met, you guys really love teaching economics. You have a passion for teaching economics. In fact, some of you, this is your labor of love. In the United States, we got, tenure. To be a really good teacher, you end up by not teaching. The goal of an academic in the United States is to have a 0-0 teaching load. That would be the plum position. Gordon Tullock, when I was a student, had 4 students in his class one time. One student signed up in the class. 4 is the minimum that you can have to have students. But Tullock, who's famous, was going to be given a break. And the secretary at the Public Choice Center turned to him and said, "Professor Tullock, you only have 1 student in your class." And he goes, "One more than optimal." Right? You guys really love teaching economics. If you understand the discipline of economics, you fall in love with the teaching of economics. And it does become a labor of love even when you're on the other side of it. And so what I try to do in here is sort of convince people, this book is written really for students that are finishing up undergraduate education and considering graduate school, or professors who are thinking about how to do economics, teaching it and researching in it. And the idea here is what I stress in teaching the basic principles of economics is basically the idea that I said before about scarcity, about trade-offs, and in particular, very quickly, property prices and profit and loss. I think this should be reiterated over and over again. Property gives us high-powered incentives. Prices gives us information. Profit and loss gives us a spur for innovation. Without property prices and profit and loss, you're going to have attenuated incentives, distorted information, and not the correct alignment of incentives for innovation. And so the countries that are poor are the ones that have poor property rights, have administered prices, have inaccurate profit and loss accounting. The ones that are wealthy, those are the ones that have relatively secure private property rights, have freedom of pricing, and have relatively accurate profit and loss accounting. Now, think about all that's involved in that, though. How do you get accurate profit and loss accounting? Well, that means that you have to have what? A monetary system that's functioning correctly. You can't deal with bouts of inflation. What else does it mean? To make sure that you're not distorting prices, it means that you're going to end up by not having regulations and fixed prices. In order to be able to have secure property rights, that means you're going to have freedom of trade, right? You're going to be able to, decide how you're going to use the goods, how you're going to trade them, what you're going to do with them, right? So a lot goes into having property prices and profit and loss. And spelling that out with your students, I think, is a very important point. Fritz can tell you this. Giancarlo can tell you this. I became obsessed with these murals. In fact, I wanted to have them. I wanted to put... Actually, that's what the cover of the book originally was supposed to be. And they said to me, the book's not that big. And I said, well, maybe there's a way to make it fit or something. I don't know. But the reason why I became obsessed with this mural, and also this one, okay, is who is on it and who's not on it. Because who's on it is the mainline tradition of economic science. And I emphasize the word science here. Who's not on it is a lot of mainstream economists. And in fact, schools of thought, agitations for the Austrian school, which I'm a member of, become highlighted at moments when the mainstream deviates so significantly from the main line. Ludwig von Mises himself never liked the word the Austrian School of Economics. It was a name that was given to the Austrians by their opponents. Mises at one point actually said in a humble moment when he was told that he was the foremost practitioner of the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, he supposedly said, thank you very much, but there's not really an Austrian theory of the trade cycle. There's really just me and Vixel. and so, it wasn't like, the Austrian theory. He actually, in 1933, he says there is no difference. There's no need to have an Austrian school anymore. But by 1950s, 60s, by the time you get around to Murray Rothbard and Israel Kirzner, economics had deviated so far from the main line that they needed to act entrepreneurially. And so the Austrian label becomes extremely important in the same way that property rights economics becomes important, public choice economics becomes important. Think about it this way. Wayne has a new book coming out with Stanford, which is on public choice economics. One of the greatest satires, which all economists know, is Bastiat's petition by the candlestick makers against the sun, a petition to the government to protect them from the unfair competition of the sun. Gordon Tullock couldn't write a better example of rent-seeking. That was common wisdom in economics. How come Gordon Tullock had to reinvent the concept in 1967? And reinvent it in such an unusual way, by the way, that it was rejected by all these journals, so that it was published in a journal that doesn't even exist today. And yet it's one of the, sort of most cited papers. Ronald Coase, when he's describing his theory in his famous FCC paper, which I know that you know about from all those, what does he say in that paper? He comes to a point and he says, my novel theory. And then he has a parentheses. He says, novel, that is, if you've never read Adam Smith. Which ironically is in fact what had happened. People forgot to read this tradition of economics that you guys are working in. And so you are the mecca for mainline economics. It like hit me, it's like should have had a V8, right? Like, boom, there it was when I'm here and I'm looking at this mural. So that's the reason why, Fritz, I kept on saying, can you send me the pics of the mural? And I wanted to get pictures of myself next to the mural and all these things like that, which, I couldn't really do. But this is this is Fritz sent me this. This is the pictures from the mural. So they wouldn't put it on the book, though. But look at that. See, it all comes all the way through. Paul Samuelson's not on that list. John Maynard Keynes is not on that list, right? John Kenneth Galbraith's not on that. Thorstein Veblen's not on that list. Let's go back a little bit. I'm making sure that I don't say this. Thomas Malthus isn't on that list. Thomas Malthus has a great debate. It's one of the first really great debates with J.B. Say. And J.B. Say, you could translate it to the debate since 2008 perfectly. Because Malthus is trying to explain the general theory of the glut. He's basically arguing that, markets failed. And Say says, Thomas, you studied economics. When we have a glut, what does that do to price? Puts a downward pressure on price, right? Yeah, I think the price system could take care of this. Don't you think? If you just let it work, it might actually pull it off. That's J.B. Say writing to Thomas Malthus. You couldn't find a different thing when Hayek basically says the same thing to the debates with Keynes. And you could also find John Cochrane today debating with Paul Krugman, or Raghu Rajan debating with Paul Krugman saying the same thing. Paul Krugman saying prices aren't going to do it. These guys are responding back and saying, hey, why don't you give it a chance? It might actually work out.